this video, we are going to learn about what is the federation and what is the session management. These both are very similar, but pretty much different. They both follow different workflows. There are specifications, there are open standard that this follows. But there are some security risk, inherent security risk, which we as a tester must know. And unless you know this security risk, you won't be able to test it out. So in this episode, my goal is to teach you what the session management is, what is the federation, and then how do you enumerate all the security risk, and then how do you test it. If you are ever doing the pen testing, threat model, code review, whatever you have to do, but this is very critical part for any product, any application. So hope you like this content. If you do, please hit the like button. It's just going to take a second to give a thumbs up to this free content, and don't forget to leave a comment on what kind of videos that you're looking for, topics, and then so I can prepare the content accordingly. Now let's get into it. So sessions allow applications to keep track of the user sessions during multiple requests. When you're logged into Facebook or any application, of course, you are making so many requests. So during that request, you do not want to that will be a very bad user experience if the application asks user to authenticate every time. So rather, it will establish the session which they will use throughout the user sessions. Now this session also used for the access control, you will have some access to others' profile, your friend's profile, but you will not have access to edit their profile. Now how does the application knows is obviously they derive some attributes through a session. Now many people think sessions are only used for the authenticated request, but that is not right. Sometimes for anonymous user is also called session. For example, you selected your preference as you want English language or some other language, Spanish, for the website, then that is also a session. Application keeps track of it. Application remembers your preference and then establish the session, even though you are not an authenticated user. Now session ID usually is generated after authentication, which is username, password. They ask for the OTP, MFA. Sometimes you use the client certificate to authenticate. You have some server and you want to authenticate, you use the client certificate. Sometimes you use smart card. Biometric is a new way of authentication as well, and it's quite popular. So ultimately, the session capabilities works pre and post authentication. So you want to keep that in mind. Of course, post authentication sessions are very critical and very impactful, because somebody can do a lot of things if they steal this session. Pre authentication is just a user preference, but sometimes I have also seen in the pre authentication session they store some sensitive data. So that's quite tricky. Now the question comes, why do we need to test? As a tester, why do I need to focus on this? So one thing is clear, session management is linked between authentication and authorization. As you can see in this graph, right? There is, first of all, when you go to any website, the pre-auth session is built, then it will user will authenticate, and then it will generate a session token, and then session management module comes into the picture. And this module will also help access control component to do its task, whether to grant access to certain resource or not. That's the task of the access control module. And then when the user logs out, the session completes. Now there is authentication, access control are very complex models. It seems very obvious, but it is not. Sometimes if you're using some OpenID or some SSO, the single sign-on, then yeah, it becomes very easier. We will see in just a little bit about the federation, but then it becomes easier. But the access control is obviously very critical, and that's why it's still on the top of the OWASP top 10. And now implementation and binding between this authentication authorization is done by humans, developers. It's not the ChatGPT or AI who is doing this. And even if AI is doing it, of course, there are more chances of making it doing it wrong way. But yeah, this is done by the developers, and developers often do not have a good background in the security, how to securely bind this session. And that's why we as a tester or security pen testers, we need to make sure we test out this functionality thoroughly. But to test it out, we need to first understand. Now the next question comes, what are the different techniques that the session management typically use? One thing, cookies. I think you must have seen this on at least 90, 60, 70% of the websites, applications that you might have used are using the cookies. So usually if you go to your browser and go to the cookies, it will store the session ID, and that's what you used for the remainder of your session with the application. Then there's a URL rewriting, which is highly discouraged. I don't think anyone should do that. So here the session ID is appended to every request and response. Very rare case that you would use that, because of course if your session ID is appended to your request, then there are chances that these session IDs will be captured in the history of your browser, at the proxy. It will be logged everywhere in your logging system, and until session expires, someone can misuse it, right? So this is highly discouraged. Third one is authentication. Yeah, so every time, this is going to be a terrible experience for the user. Imagine you have to access 5 profile on Facebook after you log in, and then every time you want to see something, you have to enter username and password. So this might there is a step-up authentication if you never heard of it. So in the step-up, how it works is, you authenticate, but suppose you want to change your credit card detail, or you want to change your password or something, they ask you to enter the password again, or either they will ask you to put OTP. This is kind of step-up authentication. This is still okay for high risk areas in the application. Actually, that's something I would recommend, but by just asking username and password every time, it's not a good deal. Then there is a HTML hidden field, a unique hidden field in the HTML. Again, with this technique, you have to find you have to create a hidden field in HTML, and then you have to pass back and forth with every request, every response to keep track of this. So this is also not a good method to implement. So these are I think these are the 4 most common methods that you will see when how the user someone is maintaining the sessions. There are also ways headers and stuff, which we will see in the future episode, and I'll dive deep into some of the security vulnerabilities with those and what kind of things you need to test. But currently, just remember these 4 to start with. Now the next question comes, what is federation? So the goal of a federation is to allow security principal, identities, and attributes to be shared across trust boundaries according to established policies. Now the key word here is to be shared across the trust boundaries. If you remember in our threat model session that we did, I think there was one of the episode in the threat model playlist where I showed how to do the threat model, and I mentioned the key word trust boundaries, and you will also see this in the federation definition in their documentation, RFC. So suppose you have one product A and then there is another product B, and you want user to access A and B but do not want them to authenticate twice. So what do? You share your sessions between these products, and that's what the federation is. User can federate from product A to product B without having to log in again, and that's a great user experience, but of course it comes with a lot of responsibility and a lot of burden on security. So it involves having common standards and protocols to manage and map user identities between identity providers across organizations and security domains via trust relationship, usually established via digital signature, encryption, and KPI. So don't worry too much about this one. We'll see those in detail, but essentially what it's trying to tell you is there is an identity provider. So suppose Okta is an identity provider. And once you log into the Okta and you have 10 different applications, be it SaaS or something that hosted on prem applications. But anyway, so those applications, all of them share the trust relation with this identity provider. And that is how the federation is going to work. We are going to see that workflow in a little while to make it more clear. So what are the technologies usually being used for this federation? Security assertion markup language. I think we have covered this in a little bit detail in the past, and also like what kind of vulnerabilities we want to see here. So then there is OAuth, which is very standard. Then OpenID specification. And then there is security tokens like web tokens, JWT, SAML assertion. This is something we are going to see in very detail in the future episodes. And I'll also show you like what kind of vulnerabilities and stuff that we want to encounter here. Now, what is the typical federation workflow? So suppose you are a user and service provider you can assume as let's say Gmail as one application with service that you want to use, and the second service you want to use is, let's say, SharePoint. There are two services you want to use in the service provider. So what you will do, and this diagram actually is from Okta, and they had best one, so I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So anyway, so the user makes a request here. Let's say you as a user wants to access SharePoint. Now before all of this, what happens is this service provider, there could be multiple, right? As I said, like there could be 10 different applications in your corporate you want to access, and there's an identity provider. In our case, it's Okta, but it could be your own identity provider. It could be your own system who will authenticate the user. Whichever system authenticates the user is called identity provider here. And that's what provides the identity. That's what tells you, okay, this user is John, this is Tom, or whatever the user is. So there is a trust relation between service provider and identity provider. And as we saw in the previous video, like they use digital certificate and some other techniques to build that identity, to build that trust. So there is already connection between service provider and identity provider. Now user, as in Tom, let's say, make a request to access Gmail. So Gmail will not ask Tom to authenticate. What it will do, it will redirect Tom to the identity provider, and the identity provider will ask John to provide username and password. And John says, okay, here's my credentials, and this it will print the ID card, or it will create a session and it will give it back to service provider Gmail. It will say, yes, this user is Tom, and then let them access the Gmail, and service provider will let you use the Gmail. Now suppose user goes to the SharePoint, and then SharePoint what it will do, it will redirect user to the identity provider, but then identity provider will tell, oh, we already authenticated this user, I already have an identity for this one, so you don't need to authenticate again. It will go back, give assertion to the SharePoint that this user is Tom, and then Tom will access SharePoint without any authentication. So it's like one time you build that authenticate, and then you can access all the applications which is attached to your identities. And that's the typical federation workflow, how it works, right? So user federate from one system to the other without any complexity. Now this is in very basic, but this is very critical to understand when you work with complex systems and how the federation and everything works. This workflow will help you immensely in the future, believe me or not. But yeah, I think that's what I wanted to teach you. If you have any questions regarding federation, session management, any of the techniques, please drop it down to the comment section. I'll try my best to answer as much as I can. And if you have any other suggestions, recommendation on what kind of episode, like topics that I should be covering, please comment it as well, because that will help me to understand what kind of content you are looking for. But yeah, please hit the thumbs up button if you haven't already, and subscribe to this channel. Follow us on Facebook as well to just get updated when the new episodes comes out. And thank you. I will see you guys next time. Bye.